On a bright, sunny afternoon in a quiet neighborhood of suburban Chicago, Jamal Johnson sat at the kitchen table. He was patiently helping his younger sister, Maya, with her math homework. "Okay, Maya," he said, leaning over her shoulder. "If you multiply 6 by 7, what do you get?" Before Maya could answer, a faint cry for help drifted through the open kitchen window. It was a soft, shaky voice that seemed to tremble with urgency. Jamal looked up and exchanged a glance with Maya. "Did you hear that?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Maya nodded, her brow furrowing in concern. "It sounded like Mrs. Thompson. She lives next door, right? I'll go check it out." With a quick pat on Maya's head, he dashed out the door, leaving the math book open on the table. As he approached Mrs. Thompson's modest home, he noticed the front door slightly ajar. He knocked gently, but the soft cry for help grew louder. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, concern lacing his voice. He stepped inside. In the corner, an old television set flickered with static, and there, struggling to adjust the antenna, was Mrs. Thompson. Her frail figure was stooped over the television. "I'm so glad you're here. This old thing won't cooperate, and I can't seem to get it to work. I just wanted to watch my stories." "Don't worry, Mrs. Thompson," Jamal replied, stepping closer. "I can help you with that, really. Oh, you're such a dear. You're always so kind." Jamal chuckled as he knelt beside the television, examining the wires and knobs. "It's just a little problem with the antenna. I'll fix it in no time." As he worked, Mrs. Thompson settled into her worn armchair, watching him with grateful eyes. "You know, my late husband used to be quite the handyman. He could fix anything. Sometimes I catch myself talking to him when I'm alone. Just the other day, I told him I'd need a miracle to get this television working again." "You talked to him?" Jamal asked, glancing up from his task. "What was he like?" "Oh, Harold was a wonderful man," she said, her eyes brightening with memories. "He loved classic shows, especially those comedies from the 60s. We'd sit together for hours, laughing at the antics of those silly characters. It was our favorite pastime." Jamal smiled, feeling the warmth of her reminiscence. "That sounds nice. What was your favorite show?" "I love Lucy, of course. Lucille Ball was a riot. I used to try to imitate her antics in the kitchen, but I never quite mastered the art of the slapstick." She laughed, her voice rich with nostalgia. "Maybe you can show me one day," Jamal said, adjusting a loose connection. "I'd love to see you in action." "Oh, you're too kind," she replied, her smile unwavering. "But I'm afraid those days are behind me. Thank you for bringing a little joy into my life today." Moments later, with a final twist of a screw, the television flickered to life, a vibrant image bursting forth. Jamal stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. "There you go, Mrs. Thompson, all fixed," he announced triumphantly. Her eyes sparkled with delight as she clapped her hands together. "Oh, Jamal, you've done it. Now I can finally catch up on my shows. You've made this old lady very happy." "Anytime. Just call if you need anything else," he said, heading toward the door. "Wait," she called after him, her voice suddenly serious. "Be careful out there, you hear?" "I will, Mrs. Thompson," he assured her, stepping outside into the warm afternoon sun. "Take care of yourself." As he walked back home, Jamal felt a swell of pride. He had made a difference today, however small it might seem. He opened the door to find Maya still at the kitchen table, now scribbling on her homework with fervor. "You won't believe what just happened," Jamal exclaimed, his excitement palpable. "What?" she asked, looking up. "I just fixed Mrs. Thompson's TV. She was so happy you should have seen her face." Maya smiled, her eyes sparkling with admiration. "You're like a superhero, Jamal. Let's get back to your math, huh?" But as they settled back into their routine, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that today's kindness might come with unexpected consequences. Little did he know, the ripple effects of that simple act would soon lead him into a whirlwind of misunderstandings and accusations, testing not only his character, but also the very fabric of trust and friendship in his life. The sun rose over the quiet suburb, casting a warm glow through the curtains of Jamal's room. As he got ready for school, Jamal replayed their conversation in his head. Mrs. Thompson's stories about her late husband and their shared love for classic television shows had sparked a sense of nostalgia in him. She had spoken fondly of the golden days of cinema, her eyes sparkling with remembrance. "Hey, Jamal, you still daydreaming about that old lady?" Marcus, his friend, called out as they met at the bus stop. Marcus's teasing grin was infectious, but Jamal felt a sense of pride swelling inside him. "Not just any old lady, man. Mrs. Thompson is a treasure, a grandma's boy. That's what you are." Marcus laughed, shaking his head. "Next thing we know, you'll be knitting her a sweater." Jamal chuckled, rolling his eye. "Whatever, Marcus. At least I'm doing something nice for someone who needs it. You should try it sometime." Yeah, I get it. You're a saint now." Marcus chuckled, but Jamal didn't mind. He felt good, and he knew that doing good for others was what mattered. As they arrived at school, the day progressed normally. When the final bell rang, Jamal stepped out of class, his spirits high. He had plans to visit Mrs. Thompson after school. The evening settled in quietly. Jamal helped his mother prepare dinner, their laughter filling the kitchen as they discussed his day. Just as they sat down to eat, a loud knock rattled the front door. Who could that be? His mother wondered aloud, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Jamal felt a twinge of unease as he walked toward the door. He opened it, and his heart sank. Standing before him were two police officers, their expressions serious and unreadable. "Good evening, son. Are you Jamal?" one of the officers asked, his tone formal. Yeah. Is everything okay?" Jamal replied, his stomach twisting into knots. "We need to speak with you regarding an incident reported by Mrs. Thompson," the other officer said, glancing at his partner for confirmation. "Mrs. Thompson? What happened?" Jamal's mind raced with confusion. The first officer sighed, stepping forward. "She has accused you of attempting to rob her yesterday." Jamal's heart dropped. "What? No, I helped her fix her TV. I would never." The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism palpable. "You need to come with us, son. We need to get your side of the story." "Wait, can I call my mom?" Jamal pleaded, feeling the walls close in around him. "Sure, but this is serious. Let's go," the second officer insisted, guiding him out of the house. Jamal felt like he was in a dream. No, a nightmare. He had always been the good kid, the one who helped others, who cared. How could Mrs. Thompson do this to him? As they walked to the police car, he caught a glimpse of his mother through the window, her face a mixture of shock and concern. Once inside the car, the officers began to ask him questions. "What were you doing at Mrs. Thompson's house yesterday?" one officer inquired, his tone lacking any warmth. "I was helping her with her television." "I swear," Jamal exclaimed, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know why she would say that. I've lived here my whole life. I've never done anything wrong." "Then why would she say that you tried to rob her?" The first officer pressed his gaze unrelenting. I don't know. Maybe she's confused? She's old and sometimes forgets things. I helped her, not harmed her," Jamal stammered, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten. The officers exchanged yet another look, their expressions still doubtful. "We'll need to investigate this further. Please stay by your phone. We may have more questions," the second officer said tersely as they pulled up to the station. "Come see us tomorrow." Jamal stepped out, his mind racing. He felt betrayed and overwhelmed as he walked back home, his heart heavy with the weight of Mrs. Thompson's words. When he finally arrived, his mother was waiting by the door, her expression a blend of worry and disbelief. "Jamal, what happened? Are you okay?" she asked urgently, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I don't know, Mom. I helped her, and now she thinks I'm a criminal," he said, his voice breaking as he fought to hold back tears. His mother looked at him with a fierce determination in her eyes. "We'll get to the bottom of this. You did nothing wrong, and we will prove it. You're a good boy, and I believe you. Remember, she's an old lady, and her brain might not be working so well." He had to find a way to resolve this, to show Mrs. Thompson that he meant her no harm. As the evening wore on, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, replaying the events in his mind. He knew he had to speak to Mrs. Thompson again to understand what had happened and clear his name. He couldn't let this misunderstanding define him. But as he prepared for bed later that night, one thought haunted him. What if this was just the beginning? What if Mrs. Thompson's fears reflected something deeper, something more insidious about their world? And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that the next day would be crucial. "Jamal Williams?" one of the officers asked, his tone firm but not unkind. He was a tall man with a buzz cut. "Yes, that's me," Jamal replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at the other officer, who stood with arms crossed, scrutinizing him with a piercing gaze. The first officer continued, "We've received a report from Mrs. Thompson that you attempted to rob her yesterday." "No, that's not true. I was helping her with her TV." His voice cracked slightly, a mix of indignation and hurt spilling out. The second officer stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "You understand that we take these accusations seriously, right? Can you explain why she would say something like this?" Jamal took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. "I just went over to help her fix her television. I don't know why she would say that." He felt a lump forming in his throat, the betrayal stinging deeper than he anticipated. "We talked." She shared stories about her husband. The first officer nodded slowly, jotting down notes on a small pad. "And what time was this?" "It was around 3 in the afternoon," Jamal replied. "I didn't do anything wrong." The second officer narrowed his eyes, his skepticism palpable. "We'll need to speak with her again. In the meantime, we advise you to stay away from her property until this is resolved." "Stay away?" Jamal echoed, disbelief flooding his voice. "I was just trying to help her." "How can she think that?" "Look, we understand this is a misunderstanding," the first officer said, attempting to defuse the situation. "But we need to follow protocol. For now, just stay calm and let us handle it." The next morning, Jamal's heart was heavy as he prepared for school. He felt the burden of suspicion even before he stepped outside. What would his friends think? Would they believe him? He tried to focus on his classes, but the unease gnawed at him, making it hard to concentrate. During lunch, Jamal sat with Marcus, who noticed the cloud hanging over his friend's head. "Hey man, what's up? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just dealing with some stuff." "Stuff? Like what?" Marcus pressed, leaning closer, concern etching his features. Jamal hesitated, finally deciding to share. "Mrs. Thompson accused me of trying to rob her. The police were at my house yesterday." "Wait, what? Are you serious?" Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. "That doesn't make any sense. You were just helping her out. How could she think that?" "I don't know," Jamal admitted, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I thought we had a good relationship. I don't know why she would say something like that." "Dude, that's messed up. You should definitely talk to her. It's not like you're some punk kid running around causing trouble." "Yeah, I'm going to," Jamal said, determination creeping back into his voice. "I just need to understand why she'd do this. Maybe she's just scared or something." As the day dragged on, Jamal's resolve solidified. He would confront Mrs. Thompson, not with anger, but with the hope of understanding her fears. He wanted to show her that he wasn't a threat, but rather a friend who had only wanted to help. After school, Jamal walked home slowly, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. He approached Mrs. Thompson's house. The familiar garden, once a place of warmth and stories, now felt charged with tension and uncertainty. Jamal took a deep breath and knocked on the door. He waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity, before hearing the faint shuffle of footsteps inside. The door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Thompson's frail figure framed by the dim light of her living room. "Jamal?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson. Can we talk?" he said, his tone steady but gentle. Her eyes flickered with a mix of recognition and apprehension. I suppose so," Please, come in. About what happened, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal took a seat across from her, meeting her gaze squarely. I just want to understand why you accused me. I thought we were friends. A flicker of pain crossed her face. I didn't mean to. I was scared, Jamal. There have been so many break-ins around here lately. And I guess I panicked. I didn't know how to react. Scared, he repeated. But I was only trying to help you. I thought you trusted me. I do. I really do, she exclaimed, her hands trembling slightly. But when you were in my house, I started thinking about all those news reports. I felt vulnerable, and then I lost my purse, and my mind just jumped to the worst conclusion. I didn't mean to hurt you. Jamal exhaled slowly, the weight of her confession settling over him. I understand that you were scared, but it still feels like a betrayal. I know, she admitted, tears welling in her eyes. I'm so sorry. I've been lonely since my husband passed. And I guess I've let my fears take over. It was wrong of me to accuse you. You're a good boy, Jamal. And I actually found my purse. He felt a flicker of understanding, but also the sting of hurt. I just want to help. I don't want to be seen as a threat. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her voice breaking. I promise I'll do everything I can to make this right. I'll talk to the police and I'll tell them the truth. Jamal felt a rush of relief, but also a lingering sadness. I hope you do. I just wish it didn't have to come to this. As they sat in silence, the weight of the misunderstanding hung in the air. But there was also a glimmer of hope, a chance for healing and understanding, even in the face of fear. Mrs. Thompson's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she shook her head slowly. I didn't mean to hurt you, dear. It's just that these days I feel so alone. I've lost my friends, my husband, and now I'm just surrounded by strangers. I didn't know how to feel safe anymore. He softened, recognizing the vulnerability in her voice. The weight of her loneliness mirrored the heaviness in his heart. But I'm not a stranger. I'm just a kid from down the street trying to help. I know that now, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But in that moment I was overwhelmed with fear. I could hear the news reports, see the faces of the victims, and suddenly you were standing there. Jamal looked towards the ground, grappling with the realization that Mrs. Thompson's fears were not entirely unfounded. Can you tell me more about what's been happening in the neighborhood? She nodded slowly, the tension in her posture easing slightly. There have been a few break-ins in the last couple of weeks. Just last month, Mrs. Jenkins, 2 doors down, had her home ransacked while she was out shopping. It's made everyone on edge, and I guess I let that paranoia cloud my judgment. Mrs. Jenkins? Jamal said, his frown deepening. He remembered seeing her gardening in her front yard, a jovial woman who always offered him cookies when he passed by. I didn't know. No one did, Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice trembling. People have been too scared to talk about it. They don't want to seem weak or vulnerable. And I thought that if I just kept my doors locked and my curtains drawn, I'd be safe. Jamal felt a wave of empathy wash over him. But locking yourself away doesn't make you safe, Mrs. Thompson. It just isolates you more. You need people. You're right, Jamal. I was wrong to accuse you. I see that now, and I'm truly sorry. I've been so afraid. I get it, he replied, feeling the weight of the situation begin to lift. But I'm here to help. I want to make sure you feel safe, not just locked away. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, her demeanor shifting as she considered his words. You're a good boy, Jamal. I've always seen that in you. I just let my fears cloud my judgment. The more they talked, the more he felt a bond forming, one that could heal the rift caused by misunderstanding. Maybe we can look out for each other. I can check in on you after school, and you can let me know if you see anything suspicious. Mrs. Thompson's face brightened, and for the first time since their confrontation, she smiled genuinely. I'd like that, Jamal. I really would. Just as they were beginning to feel a sense of camaraderie, a sudden noise from outside caught their attention. Jamal glanced toward the window, his heart quickening. A shadow moved just beyond the trees lining the street, a figure lurking as if waiting for the right moment to strike. "Mrs. Thompson," he started, his voice low and urgent. "Do you see that?" She turned, her eyes widening as she too noticed the figure. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unease. Jamal's instincts kicked in, and he stepped closer to the window, peering out cautiously. "What's going on?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know. It looks like someone is watching us," he replied, the tension in his body coiling like a spring. The earlier warmth of their conversation dissipated, replaced by a chilling realization that perhaps the danger was much closer than they had anticipated. As they stood in silence, the doorbell rang. Jamal exchanged a glance with Mrs. Thompson, a sense of unease creeping in. "I'll get it," he said, moving toward the door. Opening it, he was greeted by Mr. Johnson, a neighbor from down the street, a concerned look etched on his face. "Hey, Jamal," he said, stepping cautiously into the living room. "I couldn't help but overhear you two talking." Jamal's heart sank slightly. Hey, Mr. Johnson, we were just having a chat." Mrs. Thompson, sensing the tension, interjected. "It's okay, Jamal. Mr. Johnson, please come in. I think you should be careful, Mrs. Thompson. You know how things have been lately. I heard something troubling." He paused, turning his gaze to Jamal. "There was a mix-up the other day with a young man who fit Jamal's description. It wasn't him, but someone else was lurking around. I just want to make sure you're safe." Mrs. Thompson's face paled, and she looked at Jamal, her expression shifting from relief to worry. "What do you mean, Mr. Johnson?" "Just that there was a case of mistaken identity in the neighborhood. They caught the real guy, but it seems your fears were not entirely unfounded. I just think you should be on your guard." Jamal's stomach twisted at the implications of Mr. Johnson's words. The irony of the situation struck him. His desire to help was now tangled in a web of suspicion once more. "I'm not a criminal," he asserted, his voice steady but strained. "I was just trying to help." "I know that, Jamal," Mr. Johnson replied, raising his hands defensively. "But it's not just about you. It's about everyone feeling safe in their homes." Mrs. Thompson, caught in the middle, looked between the two men. I had no idea. I thought I was just being paranoid. I didn't mean to put you in this position, Jamal." "I understand, Mrs. Thompson. I really do," he said, trying to keep his composure. "But if we let fear dictate our actions, we might end up making mistakes, just like what happened to me yesterday." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in Jamal's words. "I think we all need a little more understanding these days. It's easy to let fear lead us to the wrong conclusions." They called it a day, and everyone headed back home, locking their doors. The next day, a revelation was coming. Jamal sat in Mrs. Thompson's modest living room, the warm afternoon sun streaming through the sheer curtains. The weight of the accusation still clung to him, a stinging reminder of the fragility of trust, especially in a community riddled with fear. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice steady but low, "I understand now why you were scared. There have been a lot of break-ins lately, and it's easy to feel vulnerable." He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "But I want you to know that I was only trying to help you." Just as they began to find common ground, a loud knock echoed through the house, startling them both. Jamal exchanged a wary glance with Mrs. Thompson before rising to answer the door. As he swung it open, he was met by a reporter, a notepad in one hand and a microphone in the other. "Good afternoon. I'm Lisa from Channel 5 News. I'm following up on the recent police report regarding the accusations against you, Jamal," she said, her tone professional but her eyes intrigued. "Can I ask you a few questions about what happened?" Jamal's stomach nodded. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," he stammered, glancing back at Mrs. Thompson, whose face was now a mask of apprehension. "Please, it's important to hear both sides of the story." The community deserves to know what's really happening here, Lisa pressed, jotting down notes as she spoke. Feeling the weight of the moment, Jamal hesitated. Okay, but I want to make it clear that I did nothing wrong. I was only helping Mrs. Thompson. Before he could elaborate, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A shadowy figure lingering at the edge of the yard, partially hidden by a tall hedge. Heart racing, he squinted, trying to make sense of the sight. The figure shifted slightly, revealing a hooded sweatshirt, the fabric draping loosely over a slim frame. Jamal's instincts kicked in and unease settled in his gut. Can we pause for a second?" Jamal asked, his voice shaky. He stepped away from the door, subtly motioning for Mrs. Thompson to stay back. "I think someone's outside." Lisa raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean? Is someone lurking around? Do you think it's related to the burglaries?" Jamal's heart pounded as he took a cautious step towards the porch. "I don't know, but something doesn't feel right." He squinted into the distance, the figure now standing still, as if observing them. "Stay here, Mrs. Thompson." Mrs. Thompson's frail voice trembled slightly. "Jamal, be careful. What if it's someone dangerous?" "I'll be fine," he assured her, though he felt anything but confident. He opened the screen door, stepping onto the porch and into the fading sunlight. "Hey, can I help you?" he called out, trying to gauge the stranger's intentions. The figure shifted again, and Jamal's stomach dropped as recognition washed over him. It was a young man from the neighborhood, someone he'd seen hanging around but never really spoke to. His name escaped him, but the tension in the air was palpable, a silent challenge hanging between them. "Just passing through," the young man replied, his voice low and unsteady, eyes darting away from Jamal's gaze. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Jamal narrowed his eyes. "You've been lurking here for a while now. Are you looking for something?" "Just looking," the young man mumbled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I live around here. Just wanted to check things out." Jamal stepped closer, instinctively placing himself between the young man and Mrs. Thompson's door. "You're not making any sense. Look, if you're here for trouble, you need to leave. We don't want any problems." Lisa, now standing behind Jamal, sensed the tension and took a step forward. "Is everything okay here? Are you in any danger?" "I'm fine," Jamal said, his eyes trained on the young man. "But I think you should go." The young man hesitated, then glanced around as if weighing his options. "Whatever, man. I'm just trying to be chill," he muttered before turning on his heel and walking away, his posture slumped. Jamal watched him retreat, his heart still racing. "What the hell was that about?" he muttered, turning back to Lisa and Mrs. Thompson. "Did you see that? He's definitely up to something." Mrs. Thompson's frail hands trembled as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Oh, Jamal, this neighborhood is changing so fast. I can't keep up with all the new faces. What if he comes back?" Jamal's mind buzzed with the implications. "He's not going to come back, not if he thinks we're onto him. But we need to keep our eyes open. If he's involved in those burglaries, he could come back to scout the area again." Lisa, sensing the urgency in the air, began jotting down notes. "This could be an important angle for my report. If there's a potential suspect lurking around, the community needs to be aware." Jamal nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "Exactly. We have to look out for each other. I'll talk to the other neighbors and let them know what we saw. Maybe we can work together to keep an eye on things." Mrs. Thompson slowly rose from her chair, her expression shifting from fear to resolve. "You're right, Jamal. I can't let fear control me anymore. I will talk to the other seniors in the neighborhood." In that moment, he realized that kindness could stem from a place of strength, not weakness. Together, they could face the shadows creeping into their lives and emerge into the light, stronger than before. But as he glanced back toward the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The lurking figure may have retreated for now, but Jamal knew that their battle against fear and misunderstanding was far from over.